Hi, everyone. Welcome to this next lecture on advanced digital editing methods. In this lecture, we're going to be transitioning into publication formats for digital editions and thinking about, in particular, how we render things like TEI XML data into presentation formats such as HTML. So in order to discuss the terminology that we use when we're creating HTML through XSLT and CSS, my colleague Gabby Baudard will review those important concepts for us. So Gabby, when you're ready, please go ahead.
Thanks, Christopher. Yeah. So basically, yes, this may seem fairly obvious, but it's really just to, as Christopher says, define some of the terms that we use when we later start talking about creating web pages and using XSLT. We'll be taking some sorts of information and understanding for granted, and this is really just to fill in those gaps for people who feel that would be useful. So this is the structure of the presentation. I will quickly and with thanks to Tom Elliott, who originally produced the slides that I'm going to be reusing here, revise the differences between two things that we both refer to as style sheets, so XSLT and CSS, which do different kinds of things, but they're both style sheets. And then I'll talk about the three different kinds of output that we might be producing in HTML, three different strategies for rendering what, in this case, textual elements, but in principle, all kinds of elements in HTML web pages. So for the first example, I'm going to, so this is the types of style sheets that from Tom's slides. So we have cascading style sheets, CSS, which apply style to HTML data or other XML. And then we have XSL, which is the extensible style sheet languages, which applies style to XML data. And in particular, the flavor of XSL that we mostly talk about, XSLT, for transformations, it applies style to XML data by transforming it into some other format, usually another XML format, such as HTML or the format behind PDF or OpenOffice documents or so forth, but it can also produce plain text or JSON or other formats. And the pipeline will often go something like this. You will have your XML. You will run a process. That's the circle in this diagram, and that process will involve XSLT, which doesn't itself create output, but it's what processes the XML into the output, and then you'll have the output coming out of that, and that output could be HTML, plain text, PDFs, or many other kinds of formats. And what this will look like is something like this. You'll have your TAI XML file or whatever XML file there on the left. I've deliberately made this slightly too small or slightly too fuzzy for you to see the content, but the point is just you've got a TAI XML file and you know what those look like. You transform it using XSLT, and that gives you a HTML file, which in itself is also an XML file, which also is fuzzy and has indentation, has lots of angle brackets in it, and so forth, right? And so that hasn't really got you any further towards publishing it, because you've still got a text file full of angle brackets, which hurt your eyes to look at too closely. But if you open the HTML file in a browser, you will get something like the thing on the left, where you start to be able to see patterns, you start to be able to see headings and numbers and lists and definitions and things like this in there, which start to give it structure and start to make sense. But what you then want to do is you want to apply your own CSS to it, your cascading style sheets, which in addition to the browser style sheets, which give you the styling that you see on the left, will give you something like what you see on the right. It gives you the look and feel of the site, but it also structures the individual content of this in a way that's more pleasing to the eye and more useful and more easy to read. And again, I've made this too small for you to really be able to read the text properly, but you can already see that this is probably something more pleasant to read on a web page than what's on the left would be, in terms of getting the scholarly information that you're looking for out of that. And so that's basically the two kinds of styling that are provided by XSLT and CSS, respectively. So I then want to talk about the three kinds of processing that we do to get our XML data into HTML. So the first is to use text to display some of these critical features that we've used XML tags to render in the to represent in the XML files. So, for example, if we've got text that's lost from the support, we might tag it using the TI element supplied, and we can simply replace that. Many conventions will use square brackets to replace to represent supplied or restored text in a critical edition. Likewise, if we've got superfluous text, we might use angle brackets. It doesn't matter whether your conventions are the same as these or slightly different, but it's the fact is that we have XML on one side and we're replacing it with various textual features on the right. And whether we're using XSLT or CSS to do this replacement doesn't really matter. You can use either, but for the simple ones anyway, like 1 and 2 on this list. But you're basically adding text in there. You could do this in HTML, or you could do this in plain text. It wouldn't make that much difference because it's still text in either case. Likewise, if you've got a regularization going on, you can use that to generate an apparatus entry saying, lege aug. If you've got an apparatus entry with an earlier reading, you can generate text on that based on some of that content. You can choose not to display some things. So you might, if you've decided to only display line numbers divisible by 5, then the line number with an n of 3 gives you no output at all. But the line number n of 5 does give you some output, and maybe you wanted to left shift it or something. But that's more complex information. But the basic thing is you're producing text or the absence of text to display certain critical features in there. The second category of content that we might create using XSLT in our HTML file is replacing the TI elements, which are largely semantic elements, with HTML elements, which are largely renditional elements. And I say largely because in both cases there's a little bit of wooliness around that. But in this case we've got so a couple of examples. Here, you might say that whenever I got a head that appears inside a div, I want to render that as the HTML element h2, which technically it's a semantic element, meaning a second level header, but for most purposes, it's a renditional element, means it has a certain size of font, it's bold, it's centered, and things like this. Whereas if I've got a head that appears inside a div that itself appears inside a div, I want to make that a h3 element, which is a third level header, or more to the point, it's slightly smaller, slightly less bold, maybe it's left justified instead of centered, etc. I might say that I'm going to take a speech element in the XML and render that as a paragraph. I might say I'm going to take an emphasis element and render that as italics. And I might say something even slightly more sophisticated, like I'm going to take a place name and I'm going to render that as a hyperlink, an ahref, with a pointer to a disambiguator for that place, for example. But in all of these cases, we're replacing a semantic XML element, TEI in most cases, with a HTML element, which for our purposes is effectively a renditional element, saying, treat this in the following way on the screen. And the third example is where we're not simply producing, wrapping our text in a HTML tag, which does something renditional to it, but instead we're wrapping it in some HTML construct which will allow us to apply CSS to it in a particular way. So we might, there's no HTML element which on its own displays a piece of text the way we want to render ligatures in a critical edition, or larger text, or the sidebar in an edition page or something. But by tagging these with classes or IDs or similar, we can then choose to apply CSS to that. And so again, without really going into the syntax of CSS in too much detail, I hope you'll get the idea of what we're talking about here. Use this first example. If I if I've tagged what in the TI is probably something like high rend equals ligature, in the HTML, if I replace that with span class equals ligature, that doesn't give it any display natively in HTML. But if I then apply CSS to this, which includes the line span.ligature, which means find me any span that has a class with a value ligature, then do the following to it, and this might not be what you want to do, but just for instance, this gives it a text decoration of overline. So it's the opposite of an underline. It puts a line of text, a line above the text rather than below the text, if that's how you wanted to render ligatures. If not, you do CSS that does whatever you do want to do with that case. Likewise, for if I say span class large, that might be high rend equals larger or something like that in the TI, but span class large in the HTML. And then in the CSS, we say span.large, which is saying, give me a span with a class of large. And this is what you do to it. You give it a font size of double extra large, because we want it to be really big on the screen. For a third example, I'm not going to give the full CSS for this because it's a little bit complicated and also a little bit browser dependent, so I'm not going to get into it. But if we've decided we want to create a sidebar on every particular page, we give it a div and we give that div an ID. Notice this is slightly different from a class. You can have multiple divs with the same class, but you can only ever have one element with a given ID in a file. So I'm only ever going to have one element that has an ID of sidebar. And so the CSS we use to point to this is slightly different. We say div hash sidebar, which specifies that this is its ID, not its class. And we say this sidebar does various things. It floats to the left. You can position it precisely on the screen. You can have it move with your scroll rather than moving with the rest of the screen. You can give it a particular width. You can make it transparent. You can make it so that it expands when you hover over it. You can do all sorts of different things to it. But this is again something that HTML natively won't do on its own without CSS to do that rendering for you. And the fourth example that I put on here, I'm not going to attempt the CSS for at all, partly because it also involves a JavaScript that's embedded on it. But there is if you look up awld.js on the web, you'll see how this has been designed. That if you've given your link, your A element, a particular class in your file, and you've got this JavaScript activated, it will create pop-ups on hover for you over those links that give you a short summary from whatever gazetteer or encyclopedia or other reference source is being pointed to in that href element. If the first part of that, the pleiades.stoa.org in this case, is a website that is recognized by that JavaScript. So again, the CSS helps you to get in the direction of having that rendering. So again, these are things that HTML on their own don't do, and they're not something that you can represent using plain text. But with a combination of transforming the XML to HTML with classes or something similar, and then applying CSS to that, you can end up with quite a significant richness. You can quite close to be able to render things as nicely as you can on a printed page, and in some cases much better, because you can't have pop-ups and hovers and things like that on a printed page. So anyway, that's just a sense. When we talk in later sessions about and here we're going to transform this into something that we can render using CSS, or here we're going to transform this and just put in some text brackets around it or something. These are the distinctions that we're talking about. Anything you want to add to that, Christopher?
Yeah, this is really helpful. So I just have one kind of question about CSS. Is it generally advisable to keep your CSS in the sort of XSLT phase of the project, or do you find examples where it might be beneficial to have CSS directly in the XML so that it's easier to process?
I'd be cautious of doing the latter, I think. In my experience, putting CSS directly in the XML either means something slightly different. So there are some TI elements that take attributes with CSS in for attempting to describe the original rendering of something rather than telling a browser how to display it. So for example, text direction, you can use some of the text direction features of CSS to say what was the original text orientation in your source document, rather than saying this is how I want the web browser to render it. And I mean, I suppose you could nest CSS in the TEI that will just be copied across by the XSLT and also appear in the HTML and then be rendered in a browser. But it feels to me that the TEI ought to be a bit more semantic than that.
Right.
So
the only time I have used CSS in TEI was when I was doing a diplomatic transcription of a document where you really wanted to control things like indentation in the source data.
Yeah.
That's the only time I've seen it done that way, but it does raise an interesting question about, when the presentational, renditional, stylistic data kind of comes in, and when it's wise to kind of keep it separate from the source data.
No, and your example, I think, is it's a case where you meet both of the categories that I was talking about. It's both using it to describe the original source and saying how you want to render it, which is the essence of a diplomatic transcription, isn't it? That I want you to display this indented by 2.5 characters because that's how it looks on the manuscript. So you're both saying, so normally if I wanted to say this is indented by 2.5 characters, I'd use a TEI element and attribute to say that, right? I'd use something like, space extent equals 2.5 or something like that. And if I wanted to nest something by 2.5 characters in the web page, I'd have a transformation create the CSS necessary to do that from whatever the semantics of that is. I always want to nest by 2.5 characters the second line of an elegiac couplet, say, or something like that. So I'd say whatever the semantic element is. But what you've just described is something where the semantics and the display are identical. I both want to say
exactly,
and I want to nest it by 2.5. And so in that case, I suppose you could. I'm still not sure CSS would be the most elegant way to do it, but it certainly would be one way of doing it. Yeah. And it might be the only way of doing it with some kinds of features in the TI, such as text direction, text orientation. That's definitely something that CSS is the only way to do.
Right. Yeah. I also wonder if you could just say a little more about features like a JavaScript file that you're integrating. If you're starting to think about interactive features like JavaScript, is that best done in XSLT, or is that done in other ways that are more efficient? I'm wondering if I'm curious about that generally too, but
no, I mean, I should say I don't write JavaScript. I can if I'm going to use JavaScript in a website, I will get one that someone else has written and just upload it and point to it from my HTML page. But no, I think the only interaction that XSLT would have with the JavaScript is that it would know it's going to be there, and therefore it would put it would put a reference to it in the header of the HTML file, and B, it would put a trigger for it on those elements that it wants to be triggered by it. But I don't think it would do anything with the JavaScript. That strikes me as too, a bit too, I don't know, crossing the streams too much.
Yeah. You're right. Yeah, I think I was just bringing that up to make the point that with JavaScript files, for example, that would be in your style sheet in some cases.
Or it would be in the HTML file. Or something, yeah. And I mean, maybe I shouldn't have used a JavaScript example there because I was really wanting to talk about CSS. And with CSS3 and some of the more advanced features of CSS, you can do quite a lot of these sorts of things, such as hovers, such as having animations and transforming and interactive features on a page in there, natively in the CSS. But as we said in one of the other videos, we don't really expect people to learn CSS. And I've never really learned CSS as a language that I want to write myself. But I know enough of it that I can add bits to it, I can tweak it, I can say, all right, now I know I want an overline on this, but I know what line to add to the CSS, but I don't want to have to create an entire CSS. Those are...
most of us are tweaking CSS and looking it up in W3C. So
Yeah. I use W3 Schools. That's a very handy reference
Yeah.
site for that and XSLT and XML and whatever else. Yeah. Great.
Thanks.
Thanks, Christopher.